I wish one of your guys had children so I could kick them in their fucking head or stomp on their testicles so you could feel my pain, because that's the pain I have, waking up every day.
Put in my venue that you can win this fight.
Are you talking out of turn?
No, I think we're all talking together.
I normally don't do interviews with women unless I fornicate with them. So you shouldn't talk anymore.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gorilla Roundtable. With us on tonight's panel are Mike, an MBA and free market enthusiast, Nick, a PhD and political economist, and Paul, a neuroscience graduate student studying addiction and humanity in general. All three have faces made for radio.
On tonight's episode, drone warfare, GMO food labeling, Greek elections, conspiracy of the week, and the Chinese Football League. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the gang of Gorilla Roundtable.
Good morning, folks. You gotta love that Mike Tyson on the intro. Got a little robotic Alec Baldwin to bring us in smoothly.
Yeah, excellent. Well done. Really liked it.
Thanks,
Baldwin. The intros just get better and better.
Hey, every week I go out of my way for you guys. What's the haps? I know a lot of stuff going on up where y'all are at.
Well, I was just wondering, what if Stephen Hawking decided to have that Alec Baldwin computer voice instead of his current voice?
It's a lot smoother. He may do, I'd say he might do better with the ladies, but my understanding he does pretty good already.
You think he might do as well as Mike Tyson does with the ladies?
Well, Mike Tyson's got the trump card, because if it is not forthcoming to him, he will just take it.
Fornicating.
Fornicating.
There should be a picture of Mike Tyson in the dictionary next to the word fornicating.
And so if you go on YouTube and you search Mike Tyson and kind of find out some Mike Tyson quotable quotes, they are all over the place. I mean, this guy there's no end to the amount of ludicrous atrocities that come out of this guy's mouth. It's absolutely fantastic.
There should be a psychiatric disorder called Mike Tyson syndrome. He's probably coming for me right now.
He'll never find you.
Follow us on the Twitter as we talk about and tweet about the topics and discussions that we've had each week, and get more insight from the gang here at Gorilla Roundtable. So let's not forget to shamelessly self-promote ourselves.
That's right.
This is America after all.
And if you guys have ideas for topics, or if you have any questions or any criticisms, post them up, because we will start discussing those.
Yeah, post some criticisms, and we will send Mike Tyson to your house.
Mike
That's
Tyson,
right.
And he
will
will
be there.
fornicate with you.
Twitter us at Gorilla RND Table. If you're lucky, we'll Twitter back at you.
And you will be lucky.
You will be so lucky, because our time is precious.
That's true.
So if we give some to you, it's a little ray of sunshine right into your life.
Everything this man is saying is true.
You will be luckier than the nation that has the most drones.
That's right. That's
armed
right.
forces.
Speaking of drones, that takes us into our first topic today. Very good segue, Paul.
I was up all night thinking of just that transition. So.
Time well spent. As human culture is evolving around this new state that we find ourselves in, there are a lot of moral and ethical questions being raised that have not been discussed before, only because the technology has not existed. So what I find myself wondering, are we being conditioned for a lack of peace? There's a certain level to which we expect global tensions, but what we're seeing now is almost a very civil Cold War, with the internet and cyberspace, writ large, becoming the new battlefield. We constantly have hackings and incursions in cyberspace, but they don't get defined as hot war. They get defined as somewhat of a Cold War, because we don't define cyber assault the same as we would a physical incursion. If China dropped some troops off on the shore of California and they assaulted local business, it would be an act of war. But if they do the same thing in cyberspace, it's not an act of war. It's more an act of Cold War. But to me, is there a difference if I bomb your resources and you end up in a shack, or if I outsmart your banking system or shut down your power grid and you end up in a shack? To me, warfare is warfare. And the use of robotics is lowering the social cost of war and stripping away some of the human constraints that would normally cause us to put a brake on that warfare. So what do we think of that? I'm interested to know what you guys think.
Actually, I agree with you. I think that war evolves just like humans evolve, culturally speaking. Now, that is not to say that we are fundamentally different biologically or psychologically than we've always been. I think we're no different, right? And so we're always this, in some Hobbesian sense, we're always kind of interested in seeking out our own best interests, and that's translated into the best interest for our tribe and now, of course, our nations. But our psychology is no different, even though wars have become increasingly covert. And so, essentially, economic and cyber warfare are just kind of the newest installments of the covert warfare that's been going on increasingly over the past few decades. Now, yeah, humanity on the whole is consistently less willing to stomach hot war. You know, there's more outcry against that, against bloody wars. But yeah, I tend to agree that I think these types of warfares is just kind of what the term warfare is merging into. And yeah, I mean, we can think back to movies like The Matrix, where essentially the world has been destroyed by artificial intelligence that has become sentient and has then gone on its own.
Right, Nick. What's your take?
Oh, I mean, honestly, Mike, I think you're. I think this is a really interesting topic. For sure. And I think to your first point, there is there's an economics of this, and I think when you take the human beings out of the equation, even for something as simple as reconnaissance, right? When you don't need a person to do it, right? It lowers the costs of doing it, right? And of course, the mass production of drones lowers the cost of the individual drones, but you're certainly more likely to conduct an operation if the costs are lower, in terms of the price of the equipment itself, not having to put humans in harm's way, and when you combine that with attaching lethal force to these things, yeah, I mean, I think they definitely up the ante in the geopolitical realm. It makes it a lot easier, or a lot more likely that there will be conflicts and flare-ups and accidents.
So
as to the cyber operation stuff, outside of some of the recent headlines with Sony, I think that those hacking type things haven't proved to be as effective as I think some of the hype suggests they are.
No, and I think that's right. Although my argument would be that we are on the cutting edge of this. This is a brave new world, and we're at the starting line. When you go add 40 years on the manufacturing abilities to produce these types of drones, it's going to be an entirely different world in 40 and 50 years than now.
Right.
Everything will be chipped.
Absolutely.
There will be data
absolutely.
coming from
And I mean,
everything.
I think a lot of privacy people worry about is the economies of scale coming down on some of the micro drones, right? On some of the smallest drones, and once these get into commercial hands, into the hands of hobbyists or whatever, there are some definite privacy concerns that worry people.
No, and I think that's right. And,
right.
And to me, this is generally, I mean, and I hate to say it like this, but there's the economic component looms large in this entire discussion, and it almost comes down to a manufacturing question. What is your manufacturing capability? And is there going to be a situation in the future? Is the normal state of being going to be where drone warfare is perpetual and current and always occurring, and we've always been at war with we're used to that. We're used to Chinese drone crashing in my backyard because it was trying to get intel from my neighborhood. Like, oh yeah, it happens all the time. It happened to me last week. I mean, is that going to be the state in which we find ourselves?
I don't know. As much as I think it's fashionable sometimes to be skeptical of international institutions, like the UN, for example. I think there is a really robust, set of international norms, laws. I mean, I know that's again a delicate subject, international law. But I think there are things to keep that kind of stuff in check. Even if it's just brute force. You know what I mean? I'm not worried about that too much just yet.
Right.
But the cyber warfare is a different question, and I mean, I think
sure, that's already going on.
Right. That's already going on, and I think to go back to the earlier point of whether we're in this state of perpetual warfare, I think cyber warfare indicates that we are. I mean, this is going on constantly, and it doesn't require manufacturing as like the drones, for example, would. Right? It just requires a force of intellectuals who are basically computer programmers that are nationalists, and that have then been indoctrinated to believe some nationalist agenda that then requires them to attack other countries. And I think that's only going to rise and continue. And to Nick's point, the provisions that we have in place by the UN, I think, are always kind of going to be undermined by particularly cyber warfare or those governments of those countries that want to always remain below the fold. I mean, for example, the criminals are always going to reinvent themselves, even as the cops make new laws and create new strategies. The criminals are always a step ahead. And,
sure.
So,
but I mean, this isn't even really an issue of. It is an issue of of cops and robbers and law enforcement and criminals. A lot of the cyber hacking and cyber attacks that China and other rogue internet elements are doing. I mean, they're doing industrial espionage. I mean, they're trying to steal trade secrets and corporate information. And I gotta say, for the United States to throw arrows and throw stones at China for doing this, I mean, that's basically what the United States did in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah, I mean,
we stole industrial technology from Britain. And set up shop for ourselves.
And you'd be alone.
So
if you...
for I mean, there's nothing new in geopolitical terms for the big guy on the block to call out the little guy for being a pirate.
And you'd be alone to say that the United States doesn't do that now. I mean, everybody does that now.
Right.
There's a reason we have plans.
Oh, sure. Everyone does do it. But I think, again, back to what I was saying earlier, I think these operations, with a few notable exceptions, right? The kind of what was the name of the virus that took down the Iranian centrifuges? With the exception of a few of these kind of stuck next, right?
Right.
With the exception of a few high profile things, right? I think cyber operations have yet to prove that they're a big deal, that they are the wave of the future. Right now, it looks like it's basically about corporate espionage and military secrets, and it's not necessarily been weaponized in any kind of aggressive fashion.
I think that's right. This is definitely one of those topics, though. I feel like it is always developing, and as technology continues to move, the question is just going to change ever so slightly. And in 50 years, we may not even be asking this question. We may have a new question that we were asking.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think when it comes to technology, especially computers, we often get wrapped up in the hype of what's possible, and we get distracted from kind of the nuts and bolts realities of what you really can do, what you can get away with. Again, I mean, I think there's a lot of things it's possible to do with computers, but I think in terms of making them a weapon, international civil society and the norms of statehood, they do constrain what you can do brazenly, right? Well, because you can be caught.
Right.
The internet isn't. It's not where you can do everything anonymously.
Right. Well, and that's if you don't have the people behind you. If the people have been trained to understand that is this is society now, then you may have carte blanche to do that kind of thing at will. There may even be a situation where there's an official elected specifically to push that agenda and to push that kind of very cold civil warfare.
Yeah.
Right. I actually heard yesterday that
before we switch topics to talk about GMO food labeling, let's just remind everyone that it's every Tuesday that government officials meet to decide who is and is not going to be on the kill list for our current drone war.
Does that happen on Tuesdays?
This happens every Tuesday. We update the list. Every Tuesday there's a meeting. I heard that on Democracy Now! This week. So
I find it interesting that there's like an Outlook invite somewhere in a calendar on someone's PC.
Yeah, come to the
a recurring Outlook for like the kill meeting.
And everyone's got to have prospects. Everyone's got to be going there pitching a case for I want so and so, or no, I want this other guy. And They all got a jockey for space on the kill list, and then
I wonder what happens if you
send the
didn't.
orders out to the drone pilots who go and drop the bombs.
So if you didn't do your research and you still have a pool of applicants for who you need to select, you just kind of pick somebody at random and bring them to the meeting because you don't want to look unprepared.
Yeah,
You just go to SUNY Homeland Security,
Right.
so which is actually in the proposal to be a new university associated with the SUNY schools.
That's
State
a real
University
thing?
of New York. I heard about this yesterday actually at a talk that this is in consideration where they're going to have a Homeland Security based university with literally that title.
That sounds fantastic. If there ever was a state that deserved that, it's New York State. So good luck, guys. So why don't we switch over to the GMO food labeling, because that's something I really did want to talk about today, and Paul's going to lead that discussion. That's I'm really happy to hear wherever you take this, Paul.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll give you an overview of the topic. Essentially, GMO food labeling is contentious right now. GMO standing for genetically modified organism. And of course, over the years, we've had debates on what we need to put on our food labels, of course, and going from the ingredients to the caloric content to how much fat, protein, and vitamins are in there, to whether or not foods cause allergies and what allergens are in there, and whether or not they're made on equipment that produces allergies in certain people. And so the latest labeling quandary is whether or not to indicate if foods have been made using genetically modified organisms, and put that on labels. And so, what are people contending? And this is just what people think GMOs might be doing and why you might need a label. Anywhere from cancer to autism to impotence, allergies, infertility. This is what proponents of GMO food labeling are claiming. However, in contrast to essentially every other labeling measure that's gone onto our products, the scientific community has essentially universally rejected the idea that GMOs are actually dangerous. Right? And so I actually looked up when you consider something like Roundup Ready corn. Roundup's a fertilizer, or excuse me, not a fertilizer, it's a pesticide. And Roundup Ready corn has a gene that makes it resistant to this pesticide, so you can spread Roundup all over the crops and not destroy the corn. Right. And so people lump together the idea of genetically modified organisms and the pesticides that are used as being problematic into this kind of this anti-organic corporate policy that has not necessarily been supported at all by any scientific or governmental panels. Now, nevertheless, it still remains very popular for people to want to have GMO labeling. So even though there's no scientific precedent for it, people still want it. So, for example, in Oregon and Colorado, recently, ballot measures to label GMO products have just been rejected, but it's been narrow. Currently, there are 2 states and 1 state that is going to have GMO labeling requirements. The 2 states are Maine and Connecticut, and then the 1 state that will probably introduce GMO legislation is Vermont in 2016. The upshot here is that essentially, on one side, people on the pro-GMO labeling side, people say, yeah, I have a right to know it's in my food, right? But on the anti-GMO labeling side, people say, number one, there's no scientific precedence for it. Number 2, we're going to have to completely revamp all of our industry and our labeling itself in order to ensure whether or not products contain GMOs. Because by now, GMOs have been used for decades. It would be so hard to separate what's actually going in and what's not. So that's the overview. And now there's 2 questions that I want to consider for the discussion. Number 1, do you think GMO labeling helps or rather does it confuse the consumer? And second question is, what would be the economic, social, scientific, and political costs to such a requirement? So I guess, Mike, why don't you take it first?
Yeah, well, you know, my take on this, on the GMO, I mean, I understand the importance of, I'll call it the GMO movement, or we'll call it the GMO breakthrough as a technology. I mean, you're growing crops where crops wouldn't grow before, and you're feeding people who weren't eating before. And I'll tell you, if you go to those people and ask them the question about would they prefer a genetically modified piece of corn or no corn, they're probably going to go with the modified corn. Domestically, here in the United States, one of the things I always find so interesting about GMOs, and Nick and I have talked about this, in separate discussions before is that you will get folks who are adamant about global warming, and they are, look at the science, look at the science, look at the science, it's the science, 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 and they will say the word science 15 times in one sentence just to beat you over the head with it. But you ask them about GMO, and they'll tell you, listen, you can't listen to the science, it's not good for you. And I always find that position to be untenable. But I do find it to be rather common. As for labeling, if it's going to help the consumer decide whether to or to not buy that product, then I say put it on the. Should the government come in and make manufacturers put that on their products? I don't think so. If you want to put it on there because you think it'll have a benefit or will help better inform your market as to whether or not to purchase your product, then that's on you.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, yeah, we've definitely talked about this before, and. I just don't see how this could do anything but confuse people. Because it's obvious from the existence of a movement about of anti-GMOs that people don't understand the science. Because the science basically says GMOs are safe. There's nothing wrong with them. There are no adverse health consequences. Nothing of that sort. In terms of labeling. I can't see it being helpful in any way other than as a scare tactic. Let's face it. The reality is literally all food is genetically modified, right? All the major food crops that humans consume that are the basis of all of our food have been genetically modified over generations, right? Domestication, right? Husbandry, saving seeds, right? Literally all food, always, everywhere, from the beginning, has been genetically modified, right? To get all worked up about it, to me, just seems to ignore what modern science says and to ignore, a sober view of what has happened in history.
And that's a good point. Right. That definitely is. To put the label on the food in itself says something's funky. Otherwise, why would it have any label at all?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So the label, regardless if it was a GMO with a smiley face, you know what I mean? It begs the question: why is there a label at all mentioned in GMO? And it makes me think of those labels that the California requires on their products that say, it doesn't say this product may cause cancer. It says California has found that this product contains an ingredient which may cause cancer. Right,
exactly. And the GMO labeling proponents might argue that, that hasn't really affected whether or not people drink diet sodas. But that's still a scientific result, right? That's even if that's the case, that's still a scientific result that's been reported. That maybe there's concern, maybe there's not. But in the case of GMOs, there's been multiple systematic studies done, multiple analyses of the reviews, and there's really no reason to have this, right? So exactly, Nick, you're right. This is just merely confusing, and there's the idea to include this sort of label just really doesn't do any good. It's not. There's no separability there. Well, and even if you can say something about what's in the product, for example, there's confusion about how to label stuff. Like, for example, does corn syrup, does that need a label even though it's kind of just derived from the corn and doesn't have the genetic components that many people are worried about, right? It doesn't have the DNA that people think is strange and mutated. We don't really know the answers to all these questions, right? And for example, actually, there was a recent survey that I also wanted to bring up that was kind of a little bit even more scary from the Oklahoma State University. And this survey essentially asked whether or not Americans would support the idea not only of labeling food that contains GMOs, but labeling food that contains DNA. So,
there you go.
Right? It's DNA. Good. Right. And so what of course do we know about DNA? It's one of the four fundamental molecules that's in terms of carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, or nucleic acids. It's in all the biological material that we eat. So it's in essentially everything.
I had a hamburger once that had DNA in it.
I
have seen
80% of Americans in the survey supported mandatory labels on foods containing DNA.
Well, that's a whole topic in and of itself.
That's shocking. That's really shocking.
I've seen those polls out there, and I don't even know who it was. Somebody put up a sign at a college, and it said "End women's suffrage," and it had some women looking, oppressed in other countries, kind of, carrying stuff in their head and whatever, and all these people in the college were coming up, all these students were coming up and signing the petition. And it wasn't to end women's suffering, it was to end women's suffrage.
Yeah.
And they were coming up and signing that, and people were like, oh yeah, this is, and so they just were not even cognizant of what was actually going on. So the results of that DNA poll just absolutely does not surprise me, because that is just how the people are, man.
There's been some criticism. Like, I read an LA Times article that criticized the wording of the study. Like, for example, they might have led people to say that based on the previous questions. So that's a caveat that I should point out. But yeah, fundamentally, right, what genetic engineering has done for a food is provide a lot more food to a lot more people at a much cheaper cost. There's no doubt that this occurred. And so we need to keep that in mind, that people keep claiming, wow, there's no evidence that that GMOs don't do this over the long term. The idea is this: people are alive today. People are able to feed their families today because of GMOs.
Yeah.
I was in the grocery store last week, and there was an apple, and it's the big sale thing on the apple was that it tasted like a grape. Okay? So
awesome.
I saw that, and I said, wow, how the hell did they do that? And I thought, should I buy that? And I thought, well, that must be genetically modified. But then it made me realize that there's got to be different levels to genetic modification.
Absolutely.
If you do a hybrid between two types of things, and it's as simple as cutting a seed. I don't know how they do this, but if they are splitting seeds or something, that's one thing. Versus, if you're in a lab and you're tinkering with DNA chemically, that's a whole nother level of GMO. So were there to be GMO labeling, I don't think that it would stop at just a simple, yes, this is a GMO product. I think you'd have to, have your terrorism rainbow there of this is an orange GMO food, and that represents 75 man hours of modification, and this is a blue food, and this represents 2 hours of modification. So I feel like there's a whole regulatory leveling. Yeah, no, that's right.
It's a waste. Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And what I find perplexing in a lot of ways is that the anti-GMO movement, the anti-vaccination movement, the roots of a lot of these are in what I would consider elements of the political left, which is usually the demographic that is pro-science, that is pro-rationality, and yet here you have these two movements that are just very obviously based on a misunderstanding of science.
It's anti-corporate in this case. It's demonizing large corporations.
But speaking of the left, I'd like to transition for us a second now into our third segment and talk about something I find super interesting, which is the upcoming Greek elections. So tomorrow, Greeks are going to head to the polls, and if you read the newspapers, if you're watching the news, what you're hearing is that the Greeks are poised to elect a far-left government, a party called Syriza, which is a coalition of left-wing, further than center-left parties in Greece. And it appears, from some reports, they're set to win an outright majority. And this, of course, is bringing back some old fears of, what does this mean for the Eurozone? Are the Greeks in? Are the Greeks out? If the will the far left take them out? Will they renege on the agreements? A couple of years ago, when in the midst of this crisis, when Greeks were having an election, the Troika, the European partners, there was a lot of scare tactics employed, against Syriza. And so people ultimately elected a centrist party that continued with the bailout program. And what you're hearing this time is Greeks feel like they have nothing to lose by electing a left government. And so there are questions about what this means for the Eurozone, what this means for the left, parties like Podemos in Spain, the Five Star Movement in Italy. There are also questions about what this means for, the rising Eurosceptic movement in places like Germany and Britain. So I think these are some really interesting questions that I'd love to talk about. And Mike, first of all, I'd like to shoot it to you. Again, a couple of years ago, the big worry was that the Greeks could leave the Eurozone entirely, and that could bring down the whole Eurozone.
Right.
I mean, what do you think? I mean, if the Greeks leave, is that the end of the Eurozone?
I don't think it's the end of the Eurozone, but I'll tell you what, if old boy gets elected, I'm pretty sure they are going to leave the Eurozone. I think they're going to have to leave the Eurozone because I think the economic impacts of moving away, or at least the perceived economic impacts of moving away from an austerity budget and moving away from basically what the Germans are telling you need to be doing, the rest of the Eurozone is not going to want anything to do with that, and they're going to push Greece out of the Eurozone if it does not leave independent of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty right on. I mean, the fact is, I mean, at this point, the markets have already priced in the possibility of another default. I mean, and the Europeans have had 2 years now to plan for how to manage Greece being out.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the calamity the first time around was based on no one knew what to do. But I mean, with 2 years of planning, I mean, not to say that it wouldn't involve pain and probably more pain for the Greeks than for anyone else. But it doesn't seem like it's the catastrophic possibility that it was a couple of years ago. No,
and to some extent, I would agree that the markets have priced it in. Although, there's still an element of, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Pricing it in is great. That means people have budgeted for this and that, and attached a statistical probability to the outcome, and took some bets on it. That type of thing. Oriented their assets based on the probability that it's going to go this way. However, there's real impacts that occur if and I can never say this guy's name, if he gets elected, because with his
Sisporus.
Yes, Sisporus. There you go. That sounds like a Greek god, right?
Alex Sisporus.
Sisporus, god of the left. He, if it goes that way, and Greece does get pushed out of the Eurozone, you're going to have a run on the banks. For anybody who is in Greece or who is holding their currency in euros in a Greek bank, they are going to withdraw that. All right, so there needs to be backup liquidity ready if that happens, if and when it happens. There's going to be stresses to the private sector that increase the cost of capital, because with Greece debt at 175% of GDP and no longer backed up by the balance sheet of the Eurozone, any lender who wants to lend money to Greece is going to raise the interest rate to compensate for their additional risk. So private businesses in Greece that may already be struggling to get through the recession that they're having and the stagnation that they're having are going to further be burdened by having an additional cost of capital.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, so, I mean, what I would want to ask you is, so let's say Syriza does win. There's a left government in Greece, and let's say that bolsters the Podemos party in Spain, and other kind of left parties in the Eurozone, and this kind of they can kind of push back against austerity. Do you think that translates or reverberates across the Atlantic? I mean, do you think the left in America, I mean, are we really going to feel the wave of that if were that to happen? Or do you think we're too insulated from European continental political developments?
Yeah, I think actually it's a good question. I think we'll remain pretty insulated from that. I think the left in America is really not much of anything like the left in Europe, especially what's becoming the populist left. And I think that although it's going to reverberate all the economic issues associated with if Greece is actually forced out of the Eurozone will reverberate in America, I don't think that's going to mobilize the left, or I don't think there might be the effect that occurs with other left-leaning parties in Europe. But I also wanted to say something else about Syriza in general. And I mean, I think that if Syriza wins, it seems to be the case that Alex Tsipras, I think is his name, right? He's because Syriza is becoming more populist recently, and there's so many supporters in general. It seems as though they would not necessarily push for Greece to be out of the Eurozone. In many cases, it could be the case that they fight for them to remain in, at least initially. Now, you may disagree with that, but I think the reverberations to America would not be, and maybe to other parts of the world as well, would not be as strong as one might think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious, why you think I mean, why has there been so much pushback against austerity in Europe, and seemingly less so in the United States? I mean, there was the sort of very short-lived Occupy movement, and sort of since that was kind of suppressed by, municipalities across the country, we've been kind of quiet. And so I'm curious what you think about that.
I think Americans are more fearful, actually. I mean, what you saw with the Ukrainian crisis is right on their doorstep. You saw essentially the beginnings of a revolution occur, right? And in America, something like this is completely foreign to us. I mean, yeah, there are radical things going on in America, but at the end of the day, a large portion of people who are sympathetic to the Occupy movement are still going to go home and watch CNN or something like that. I think we're just a lot more frightened by our more consistently militarized police, and we're just not as radical, I think, as a culture. We're just almost in some ways too comfortable.
I mean, do you think that part of it in America is simply the size of our country, and the ability that we have to deflect the main effects of austerity on certain segments of the population? For example, minorities, women, right? These people bear the brunt of austerity more than others. And so, maybe that we're able to kind of hide from public view the kind of crippling effects of austerity that they can't do it the same way in Europe.
Part of it, too, is cultural. And that...
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it, too, is cultural. And the reality is, if you are in a situation, you're in a culture that is used to a more giving safety net, if you want to call it that, austerity will have a bigger bite than if you are in a culture where you are used to a very minimal safety net.
Right. I think
Definitely.
That's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, I'm very excited. I'll be watching Al Jazeera tomorrow and trying to see what the Greeks do and how they vote, because I'm rooting for Syriza. I don't know what is necessarily best for the Greeks to be in or out of the Eurozone, but I certainly think that it's a fantastic opportunity for a rising left tide, an anti-austerity tide in Europe. But again, we'll see what happens. And again, I think Paul's, you had some interesting worries that I think are pretty right on about. Yeah. Even if they're successful, it might not translate here the way that people on the left would want to.
Right.
Yeah, you could have a situation where even if they get away from austerity, you still may have a very good result.
It'll be really interesting.
Yeah. So, and now it's time for the conspiracy of the week.
There's a conspiracy out there. You know what I'm saying? There's a conspiracy. A C-O-N conspiracy.
Now, guys, we all know about Charlie Hebdo, and we have talked about it on this very program of Learned Gentlemen. But do we know, and have we heard of a false flag operation?
I've heard of the idea of a false flag operation, yes.
All right, so and let me enlighten the folks who are not so enlightened. And a false flag operation is an operation that is designed to look like it was done by somebody else. So if I go to Nick's house and I make a dookie on the floor next to his toilet and I sneak out of his house and his girlfriend finds it, she may think that Nick has done it. And I would have thusly committed a false flag operation. And she'd say, Mike, how does that dookie...
Perfect example.
That's right. How does that dookie play into this? How does that have anything to do with Charlie Hebdo? Well, there are certain folks out on the internet, which is the paragon of truth, who believe that there are a lot of inconsistencies in the Charlie Hebdo attack. They point to professional yet bumbling shooters, the fact that the shooters left their ID in a getaway car. Why would professionals why would they do that? They should know better. Who does that? That's something a crackhead does. That's like crackhead level crime. They also point to the fact that Helrich Friedau, a high-ranking member of the French judicial police, committed suicide in the middle of the night in his office while he was writing his report on the Charlie Hebdo attacks. They asked questions: why would an attack on Charlie Hebdo magazine happen despite the tens of thousands of Muslims killed by military over the last decade? Wouldn't there have been a better target to vent your rage and to be the recipient of your rage than a magazine? So those are some of the questions that are out there. Or even if you were to agree that these inconsistencies exist, why would this be a false flag? Well, a lot of folks have asked, the timing of the Charlie Hebdo attacks was suspiciously close to some announcements the French made about the Middle East. They were suspiciously close to the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. And for those of you who aren't following that, Jeffrey Epstein was kind of a billionaire hedge fund guy. He had a lot of underage girls on his private plane and his private island. He's now being dragged into court by one of the girls who said she was underage at the time. She has fingered Prince Andrew, and she has photographs of being with him. Also implicated are Bill Clinton, who has been on the plane and has been to the island 20 or 30 times, Alan Dershowitz, and a bevy of other billionaires and high-powered folks. So the conspiracy is that because these folks are tied to this Jeffrey Epstein scandal, which had kind of broke wide open very close to when this Charlie Hebdo shooting took place, that the Charlie Hebdo shooting was a false flag, suck up all the media so that it couldn't focus on this Jeffrey Epstein scandal. So what do we think of that, gentlemen? Now, we know that people in power and billionaires do this kind of shit. Silvio Berlusconi comes to mind with the bunga bunga parties and the underage girls and so on and so forth.
Well, that's just cultural. He's there. It's Italian. It's Italy.
Right?
Come on.
Right. Come on.
Well, I always wonder, with the caveat that last week in the show I said that I, believed all conspiracy theories because it's easier.
Well, this is an easy one for you then.
Yeah, it's easy. Let's
face it. There's only one billionaire who could have pulled this off. Charles Widmore.
Backed by Bill Gates.
That's right. That's right. And what's that? The Clinton Global Fund.
Yeah. Right.
I guess if we do have a real life Charles Widmore, Bill Clinton is about as close as we'll get.
And it always amazes me how much people can, stretch evidence, or rather stretch the lack of evidence in these cases. So, what sort of evidence are these conspiracy theories pointing to in this case to suggest that there can't be any, right?
No, I think a lot of it's by implication. So there's questions about timing and questions in the fact pattern that are simply that, unanswered questions, or questions that are not answered to the satisfaction or don't pass the smell test. And so I think the way it works with this particular one is when you stack all those questions up, it's somehow the fact that you have 30 or 40 unanswered questions, somehow that implies that this is a true conspiracy theory.
Yeah, I get it. It's a win-win for every side. AQAP, they get a real PR boost out of this. They get a successful attack in Paris on a high-profile target, and French politicians win because they get a nice, they can play the victimization and nationalism cards. Bill Clinton gets the scandal, gets the distraction he wants. Right, everyone wins. I think it's it's perfect.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, though, if you are the folks who performed the Charlie Hebdo shooting, you may be very upset because if you had a specific purpose in mind and you really wanted to drive home that message, now you find that your message is, it's almost downgraded because people are like, well, it's just a conspiracy and it was just, it was crisis actors or something.
Sure, somebody let it happen, so they didn't do it legitimately.
Yeah, right. You'd be angry, like, man, I spent a lot of time planning this.
I see that.
You can always count on Bill Clinton to photobomb you.
Yeah, that's right.
Always,
a man will never pass up a photo opportunity, that's for sure.
Interesting stuff, guys. So, I just wanted to talk about that briefly, and then I really want Nick to talk about the Chinese Football League, because I think that's tremendously interesting.
Yeah, so I came across this a while ago, and I found it very interesting. And what I didn't realize at first is that apparently this is an arena-style football, but apparently it's played outdoors. And so my first thought was, it's not enough for China to be the number one economy and to be the global hegemon. Now they got to win the Super Bowl too. So I'm just curious, are you guys worried about China? We already know they're going to take over the world if you believe the conventional economic wisdom of pundits everywhere. But are you worried about them taking over the NFL? Me, not so much. I hate the NFL, and with the amount of rapists and murderers and other nefarious types, child abusers and wife beaters that they have got going on, maybe the Chinese state party discipline could do some good in the NFL.
So it does not surprise me to find out that there is
Only if they recruit Vince McMahon.
It does not surprise me to find out that there is an American behind the Chinese Football League, a guy named Marty Judge. Okay, now, so as I was looking into this, one of the things I thought of was that if China starts playing legitimate NFL-style football, and the United States starts playing or continues to play legitimate NFL-style football, there's going to come a time where the teams are going to compete. Even if it's kind of goodwill game type stuff, I mean, that's going to happen. And what I see coming from that is almost a global league on par with the World Cup. So can you imagine a world where instead of every country fielding a team to the World Cup, you had people fielding team to a true World Super Bowl?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a phenomenal thing.
Well, I mean, it just makes me wonder. I mean, if the Chinese can take over football, I mean, ice hockey.
Do we have a chance?
What can't? I mean, highlight. What can't they take over?
The other thing about this is that football has a reputation domestically for sucking up talent that would go to other sports. Now, I don't know if you guys are sports guys, so you may not have realized that, but a lot of the complaints from other sports are down at the learning levels before you get to the professional levels, that you get a kid who's athletic and they may excel at baseball and football. However, they choose to play football for whatever reason. Now, that choice is made more often than you would think. So there's almost a talent suck into the NFL from the other sports. So I find interesting imagining this global, this global league. I find it interesting to contemplate whether that's going to happen in these other countries as well.
Well, let's note that last season's champions of the China American Football, or technically the American Football League of China. Last season's champions were the Shanghai Nighthawks.
There you go.
So everyone who wants to be cool, and a fan of a winning team, but before they were cool, get your Shanghai Nighthawks jerseys and caps. Get them all now, and get on the bandwagon before everyone else.
This is a great opportunity for anybody in the United States who always wanted to own an NFL team to get to China and start it on the cheap, man. We talked about how much money Paul has set aside to start his coup.
That's like so much else in American social status climbing. Can't afford the American version. Go buy one that's made in China.
Well, my point to this was Paul stated how much he's got saved up to fund his coup. He may want to take it another direction and purchase a arena Chinese football team.
That sounds awesome. Awesome.
I'm telling you, Paul, owning a Central African regime, much more profitable, especially if it's mineral rich.
Right. Well, I think Russ has already got that locked up, unfortunately.
Got a lot of decisions to make, Paul.
Right. In this context, I mean, I'm kind of skeptical because I think for China, it's a cultural question for sports, and for every country, it's a cultural question more than it is an economic question. Because for football, for arena football, whatever, this is rooted in our culture, right? I mean, before America was a global superpower, it was playing football, right? And it was uniquely American. It was, of course, an offshoot of association football and rugby, from Europe. But nevertheless, football is created as its own thing in America. And I just don't think that cultural support is there, at least yet, in China. That's not to say that it couldn't occur.
So you don't fear the Chinese takeover of football?
At this point, I don't see it. And I mean, of course, this isn't the case with baseball as much, but for football, right, it's everyone's recruited from within the country. Everyone's recruited pretty much domestically, with I think very few exceptions. And I mean, for this type of global empire to occur, China, would recruit both domestically, but also I think, they would have to recruit internationally as well. I think so. It would kind of turn into this global game, but at the start, I'll go back to my original point is the Chinese as a people, they're not big football fans, right?
Yet.
No, that's good.
Yes, you gotta tell because the economy hasn't planned that in yet. I mean, once the planned economy has dictated that everyone will be a football fan, they will.
And what about table tennis?
Well,
martial arts. What about the UFC? That's much more likely.
What about the NFL growth in the United States? I mean, it has been growing for the last, call it 50 years. However, it has not been. It was not 50 years ago the phenomena that it is now.
No, not even close.
And so everything has to start somewhere. And just because, we can kind of poke fun at the China Football League, but the reality is, when the NFL started, it was probably this. And there would have been the equivalent of us having this same conversation about it. So I think the future's bright for the China Football League if they stay on.
Do not underestimate the Chinese.
Nope.
No, I don't underestimate them. But in terms of sport, my point is just that just your economic hegemony does not dictate that you become also a leader of that sport or an organizer of that sport.
No, but
I think history has shown us that.
But if the two largest superpowers on the planet are playing that sport, man, and you're a smaller country wanting to get in the game, you may field yourself a team.
That's right. I mean, we all remember how the Cold War was
play
won.
with the big dogs.
The U.S. won a hockey game.
The hockey game, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
So, sport, the Vince Lombardi Trophy will be the symbol of global leadership. Whoever possesses that will be the global hegemon.
Do you remember when they started
allowing all the Chinese letter tattoos that NFL players have right now would make a lot more sense?
Do you remember when they started allowing the professional American athletes to play in the Olympics? Do you remember that?
No.
And they fielded the first Dream Team basketball team.
Oh
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you remember when the team first got beat? The first time it lost.
Oh my God! Yeah,
it lost its first
America
game.
Felt humiliated.
And I don't remember who won, but they were it was like a shit talking fest, man. They were just like
it was like Slovenia or something,
right? And so, can you imagine if the Chinese, the first time a Chinese NFL team or a Chinese football team with NFL comparable rules beat an American team? I mean, it would be a propaganda.
Literally, the entire state of Iowa would vomit collectively in unison.
Yeah, but think of what the Chinese would be like. Man, we did it. We have arrived.
Exactly. That would be their miracle on ice.
That's another version of this Cold War we're talking about. Just another arm of it.
Well, it didn't work out for the Slovenians, but perhaps for China, which is already a lot more powerful, it could.
Well, very good, guys. I think this has been a good discussion today. Folks, this has been another week of Gorilla Roundtable, Episode 3.
Once again, remind you all to check us out on Twitter, follow our amazingly provocative and interesting tweets, subscribe on YouTube, and Gorilla Roundtable will be back next week with a whole new episode.
Yes.
All right, folks. Have a nice week. Adios.
Bye-bye.
And so